in our lives, in our country, as it is in heaven. Give us every day what we need. Give us the strength to forgive those that have sinned against us. Forgive us of our own sins. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from all evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. Use these webinars, we pray, in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, with the power of your gentle Spirit, to your glory. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. Becker. Well, before I begin the formal introduction of Congresswoman Hartzler, I just want to give a little personal story of, I met her in late 2018. I had a scheduled meeting with her in Washington, D.C., and I think I must have been first on her schedule in whatever morning that was, and it snowed that morning. And so I was close enough to jump on a metro and just go into D.C. that way, so it didn't get slowed down. But her staff, of course, you know, traffic on the D.C. roads during a snowstorm, that's not a good place to be. So, but I think I was still 15 minutes early, and I just leaned against the wall of the hallway outside of her office and probably had my head buried in my phone. And up walks Congresswoman Vicky Hartzler with, you know, her arms there, and I didn't even expect her to stop. I figured, you know, she would go into her office. I was just a random person standing in the hall, but no, she said, "Oh, hello, are you the professor that I'm supposed to be meeting this morning?" Something like that. And engaged in conversation with me right there in the hall, greeted me, apologized that her staff was probably going to be running late because of the snowstorm, and had a nice 2-minute conversation. And then she went into her office, excused herself. But that told me something about Vicky Hartzler, that she's a genuine person who just really likes individuals, likes people, wants to serve them, and she's doing that for her people in Missouri. And so let me give you then the formal introduction to Congresswoman Hartzler. She was elected in 2010, and she's a Republican from Missouri's 4th Congressional District, which comprises 24 counties in West Central Missouri. She's a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee. She's the ranking member of the Tactical Air and Land Subcommittee, and she plays an instrumental role in designing the annual National Defense Authorization Act. She's also the senior member of the House Agricultural Committee and is one of a handful of members who live on a working farm. In her district, the Congresswoman's focus has been on combating the opioid challenge that is prevalent in rural communities. She's expanding broadband access for underserved areas, which is important to meetings like this. And she's working to improve federal response to natural disasters that are common in the Midwest. And in fact, as we're getting ready to do this, she's under a thunderstorm, severe thunderstorm warnings out there. So we just pray that she would continue to have access to video and that they'll be protected from any bad weather. Recently, President Trump signed Hartzler's bill to streamline FEMA processes into law. On a national scale, Hartzler has been a leader in advocating for our national defense. She was an early China hawk, supporting efforts to stop China's unfair trading practices and aggressive military posture worldwide. This includes serving on a bipartisan China commission and shining light on human rights and religious rights abuses taking place under their communist rule. Congresswoman Hartzler's Christian faith is very important to her. As the leader of the House Values Action Team, she's advocated for the protection of religious liberty both here and abroad, and has led legislative initiatives protecting life and other conservative values. The Congresswoman, her husband Lowell, and her daughter Tiffany live on a working farm in Cass County, Missouri. So if you had a way to applaud, I would ask you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Congresswoman Vicky Hartzler. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Perry. It was such a blessing to get to meet you, and I feel very honored to be asked to be here today. I appreciate what you're doing and what Regent University is doing to train up leaders and impacting our nation and our world and God's kingdom. So keep up the great work. Thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for each one of you who are on this call, on this video. What an important topic. I love it. Keep the flame burning, fueling the fire of representative democracy in a time of social isolation. You know, Jesus implored us to be the light of the world and to not hide our light under a bowl, but to let our light shine for everyone. And certainly during this pandemic and this election year, this is really the time for all of us to shine, to take off any bowl if it's hiding, and to be bold and to share with others the good news that we have both for our nation as policy-wise, but also the good news of Jesus Christ. So it is a time of unprecedented opportunity, but also challenges. We are facing a war against unseen enemies on multiple fronts. Certainly, we are waging an economic battle. We are waging a health battle. And I would add, are waging the ever-present spiritual battle during this time as well. And so now is the time to deploy all our weapons in the political arena, but certainly the spiritual arena, to make a difference during this time that we have been given to be here on earth. As you know, as far as Congress goes, we have done unprecedented action in order to try to address the problem before us. We've passed over $3 trillion worth of bills to help individuals, businesses, healthcare workers, hospitals, churches, farmers.
Well, I think we've lost Congresswoman Hartzler at the moment, and hopefully she'll be back with us in a minute. I know that she showed us her radar, and there was a huge line of red, if you know what the radar looks like, where the heavy rains were coming toward her. So if she joins us, if she's able to come back in, certainly we'll ask her to finish what she had to share with us, and hopefully she knows where she where she left off. She already shared some really great things with us. Clearly this is just an unprecedented time. We know that what's going on in Washington, D.C. With the Congress, one positive thing is that there is a lot of cooperation that we don't always see in DC. There's still some bickering, there's still some fighting, but we have seen certainly some cooperation there. But we have audience members probably today, and we will have during the week, that aren't from the United States. And I know your countries are also going through very difficult times, and people are suffering. The healthcare systems are stressed. And so we just pray that wherever you're from, as you're joining us on this, or as you view it after the fact, we pray that your leaders also are able to find ways to help the people in your countries as well. Well, it looks like we may have lost power out there from Missouri to have Congresswoman Hartzler on, but we do thank her tremendously for taking time to speak with us today. And I can't really think of a better person to address this, being the head of the Values Action Team for the House out there in DC. She's the perfect person to talk to us about how Christians should respond in this time, and to kind of show the compassion. I lived in the Midwest for a long time too, and I know that the Midwest values that the people who are farmers and work the fields, and they certainly value their communities. They value good morals, and they certainly would value the things that we do at Regent University and that we're doing in our webinar series that we're sharing with you in the next 3 days. So, all right. It looks like we probably will not get Congresswoman Hartzler back, but we will send her a message thanking her very much for sharing with us. But if she pops back, we may change that. So I guess at this time, we'll invite our panelists to go ahead and turn on their videos. For those of you who are in the audience, you will find that there is a speaker view that will let you see the person who's speaking as kind of the prime video. And there's also kind of a mosaic view where you can see everybody at the same time. And it's up to you which way you watch this. If you're watching this recorded, it will default, I believe, to the speaker view. Have that option, but those who are watching live at least have the mosaic view if you prefer, or the speaker view. Okay, it's called Politics, Stewardship, and Pandemics, How Christians Should Respond. And there's going to be a chance for you, the audience, to ask questions of our panelists as we go on today. We will save that time for remaining. There's a Q&A box. And I see Congresswoman Hartzler's video, or her, looks like she may be trying to get back on here. And so if she's able to speak with us more, we can jump back into that.
Yeah.
Okay, she's back.
Well, I gave a really moving speech. You all enjoyed that.
The wonders of technology.
No, I'll show you what I'm looking at.
We definitely did.
Anyway, we've got hail going on here and a severe thunderstorm. I'm glad I'm trying this on my phone so you guys can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
go ahead and
was I
at this point I can't tell you exactly where you were, but you go ahead and start from where you think you maybe got cut off. So
okay, well, thank you all. Crazy times in many ways, but as I was saying, we really are facing a war on multiple fronts. We are facing an economic battle, a healthcare battle, and a spiritual battle, and it's time for all of us to have all hands on deck in order to meet these threats and to overcome them. In Congress, we have passed, as you know, 4 major pieces of legislation that have, we've spent over $3 trillion investing and trying to help individuals through this time. We've been given money to businesses and healthcare professionals, our farmers, even churches can apply through the PPP program. And but it's not enough. We've got to reopen our country, and I'm encouraged that Missouri is just starting to do that today. But it's going to take a while for our country to get back on its feet, and I know Congress is going to continue to address it through legislation as best that we can. There's been a lot of people impacted by this. We've had over 30 million Americans right now who are out of work. 67,000 individuals have lost their lives. And with that, that means 67,000 families that have had funerals and are grieving. But there has been, I believe, some positive things come out of this as we go forward that's going to impact our nation positively. For instance, telehealth. This is something that has been spurred into expansion because of the need to distance, and yet it's very, very popular. It has also exposed, though, a real need that we have for more rural broadband, including where I live right now on our farm in Cass County, Missouri, where we really don't have access to high-speed internet that we need. And with people teleworking, with students being online and taking their classes now, and just the need to have more internet, I think it's going to help spur more rural broadband going into the future. It also has highlighted America's innovation in that we have really focused on getting more treatments and more vaccines, and I'm encouraged. We just announced and they released an emergency use authorization for remdesivir, and that is having very positive results with treatments. We also heard this weekend that they anticipate we might have a vaccine as early as this fall or this winter, which is record time. And that would certainly be very, very helpful to us. We also, I believe, are going to bring manufacturing back to our country. This coronavirus has exposed the vulnerabilities that we have with our dependence on China. As Dr. Perry said, I've been focused on China for a long time as a member of the Armed Services Committee, and know that we need to become more self-sufficient from them. In September, I introduced a bill that would bring back our pharmaceuticals to the United States, because I found out that our military is getting all of its medicine, its vaccines, and its antibiotics and vitamins from China. And yet China is our #1 adversary. That's not a good place to be at. And so I'm hopeful I'll be able to get that legislation through the National Defense Authorization Act. But just in general, this has shone the light on China and their tactics, the way that they withheld information, squashed that, and endangered the entire world. is, I believe, going to change things going forward in an international way as our allies and everyone tries to reduce our dependence on China. But other positive things is how we've seen communities and individuals step up, from businesses converting to make hand sanitizers, to neighborhoods doing drive-by birthday celebrations for older citizens and veterans in their community, to individuals helping out, volunteering at food banks, donating, ladies making face masks. It's just been heartwarming to see America stand up. And it's been encouraging to see the changes made in churches as they've had to go out of their four walls into the community, just like Jesus said, to go and make disciples of men. The church has been doing that with these drive-in services and really going online, using social media more. And so hundreds of thousands of people now have heard the gospel and are listening to services and are meeting Jesus. And that's the most important thing. And I hope when we get through with this pandemic, that the church will continue to be creative, will continue to be relevant, and to be involved in the communities. This pandemic has really brought out and shown the goodness of America and also the greatness of America. I've liked that we really are a city shining on the hill, but we can't take it for granted. And in amidst this pandemic, we are also facing a huge election, which will determine the course of our nation going forward. It is really time to engage every one of us on this Zoom call in our own way, in our own sphere of influence this election year. But it is a wonderful time of opportunity for Christians to make a difference. We need to pull out every tool in our toolbox in order to inform voters about the issues and to inspire voters to get out and vote. You know, I read a scripture a month or two ago that I was reminded of and wanted to share. It, I believe, provides a lot of insight into what really motivates people to get involved. And it revolves around a story of David when he was fleeing from Saul, went to the cave of Adullam. And it said David's brothers and his father's household went to him there. And then it said, and those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered to him there, and he became their leader. And I thought those are the 3 days of D's of political motivation. People who are in distress, and that could be multiple ways. They could be physically in distress. They could be spiritually in distress. They could be emotionally in distress, financially in distress, security in distress. They don't feel secure. Or it could be they're in debt. And a lot of people with this pandemic lost their jobs. Their finances are hurting. And then people who are just discontented with the way things are. And those people are looking for a leader, looking for someone who they can turn to help provide the answers and help address the concerns that they have. So they won't be in distress anymore. They won't be discontented, and they can get out of debt. And so we have the opportunity to provide those answers, those positive solutions that are needed in the political world as well as in the Christian world, to point them to the answers that we need to go forward. And so I applaud each of you on this call for your leadership and for what you are doing to help in this time. And as you prepare leaders in the future, we really are and need to continue to be that light shining brightly in our communities and also as a nation in our world. And I look forward to working with you to see that America continues to be that shining city on the hill, a beacon of faith and liberty and freedom and hope. So thank you for having me on, and God bless you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Hartzler. This has been wonderful. We just so appreciate what you shared with us and your heart for America and for the work you all are doing there in Washington. You know, we do all need to stand together during this time of pandemic, and it is very heartening to watch our people in our communities, stepping up and just doing what needs to be done in the churches, in the neighborhoods. And so it's exciting to just be part of this very unusual time and just be in anticipation for good things to come out of this. So thank you so much for sharing with us and for your message.
You bet. God bless. Bye.
All right. God bless you. All right. Well, we certainly have had a little bit of different opening here with weather events. So we'll now, again, invite our panelists to come back. Let me just remind the audience, at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A button. That's where you can should be able to post questions. And my co-moderator, Kylan Griffith, will be gathering those. And as we get about an hour down the road, she will read some questions for the panel to try to answer them based on what you've posted. So we will be moving in that direction. But let me introduce the panelists who will now be part of our politics, stewardship, and pandemics, how Christians should respond, part of this panel. So I'll start with Katie Gorka. She serves as the Fuel Institute Center for Civil Society, as the director of the Fuel Institute Center for Civil Society and the American Dialogue. In 2016, Katie joined the Trump transition team and then served as a senior advisor in the Office of Policy at the Department of Homeland Security from 2017 to 2019. And there she focused on strategies for prevention of terrorism and targeted violence and combating use of the internet for terrorism and human trafficking. From June to August 2019, she served as the press secretary for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency. As president of the Threat Knowledge Group from 2014 to 2017, Katie provided expertise and training on irregular warfare and terrorism to the FBI, U.S. Army Special Forces, Marine Corps, and law enforcement. Before that, she was the executive director of the Westminster Institute, which conducted research and education on threats posed by extremist ideologies. She earned her Master of Science in Politics of the World Economy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's lived in Budapest, Hungary, and she did that for 12 years, where she worked on aspects of the post-communist transition, including projects to help rebuild civil society there. Today, Katie Gorka lives in McLean, Virginia, with her husband, Sebastian, and they have a son and a daughter. So welcome to our panel, Katie. And I don't think the kinds of terrorism you were looking at were not virus related. So this is a little different, isn't it? Okay, so Eric Patterson is the executive vice president of the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C., where he works to advance religious literacy for public officials and strives to advance religious freedom at home and abroad. So he was previously the dean and full professor at the Robertson School of Government. And so I have filled his shoes, maybe poorly, but we have served in the same capacity there. And he continues to serve on our faculty in the School of Government as a scholar at large and teaches classes for us. He's on the advisory board of Regent University's Constitutional Law Center as well. Patterson's the author or editor of 14 books, and those include Politics in a Religious World Toward a Religiously Literate U.S. Foreign Policy. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Patterson. And we mentioned family for others. I know Dr. Patterson's wife, Jennifer, and his two kids live with him in the DC area on the Virginia side of the border. So we're glad that you're with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Next, Judge Joseph Wood. Now, Joseph Wood is a foundling. That's not the way you see most people's biographies start, but he was abandoned in the streets at birth and was placed in an orphanage and eventually found his forever family. Joseph's mother was an educator and his father was a construction worker. Education and hard work, along with serving the community, were expected in the family, and their values he continues to instill in his children and his grandchildren. Now, Joseph is the first Black elected county judge in Arkansas history. He serves in Washington County, which is the third largest county in the state and one of the fastest growing in the nation. Joseph has previously served as the Arkansas Deputy Secretary of State, 3 terms as the treasurer of the Arkansas Republican Party, and is the assistant director of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. His private sector experience includes being the head of international recruitment for Walmart and as an Illinois State Bank commissioner. He holds a Master of Christian Leadership from Ecclesia College and a Bachelor of Business Administration from Iowa State University. He is a Council of State Government Henry Toll Fellow, and he's the recipient of the Angels in Adoption Congressional Award from the U.S. Congressional Caucus Adoption Institute. Joseph has published 2 children's books, Saving Joey and Adopting Joey. And he and his wife, June, have been married for 28 years. They have 3 daughters, Paris, Lauren Jayla, and Candace. And he enjoys their 2 grandsons, Brian and Joey. Now, Judge Wood, I think your 2 books have the name Joey in them, and your grandson's name's Joey. Is there a connection there?
It is. It is. He's named after me, and that's what they call me growing up, is Joey. And the children's books are about me and my growth, but he thinks it's about him.
Perfect. That's the best way. Awesome. Thank you for being with us today. I'm going to introduce you to Jeff Gardner. Dr. Gardner earned his master's in medieval history from the University of Kansas and his PhD in communication and arts from Regent University. He teaches political communication as an adjunct professor for the Robertson School of Government. For over a decade and a half, Dr. Gardner's worked as a go-between for NGOs and nonprofit organizations throughout 25 countries across North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. In 2007, he co-founded and became the CEO of Catholic Media International, a global humanitarian media and communication company. Dr. Gardner frequently travels in the Middle East, working in countries like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, where he advocates for refugees and the victims of ISIS and its terror. And I know, Dr. Gardner, that when he actually took classes from me a few years ago, and I remember him saying, you know, I'm not going to be able to be in class for a couple weeks. I'm going to the Middle East. I'm flying into Iraq, and I can't tell you where else I'm going. So and when he got back, he said things like, the bed bugs weren't too bad this time. So Dr. Gardner, I know you have definitely sacrificed some comforts for the work you do. Dr. Gardner's writings, photographs, and media analysis have been featured in numerous national and international publications and broadcasts. So you can add this to your list. You know, the Robertson School of Government webinar on Keep the Flame Burning. I think that should go at the top right above things like Eternal Word Television Network. See, this is the pets joining the webinar. Eternal Word Television Network, Relevant Radio, National Catholic Register, Conservative Review, Aletia, Newsmax, Fox News, and Sean Hannity. But this should definitely be at the top.
You know, thank you very much, Dr. Perry. Yeah, broadcasting from the Hasaka Valley in Syria has got nothing on this. So
okay, good. See, perfect. That's what I thought. Well, thank you. We're so glad you're with us, and
thank you.
I know you'll contribute well to our conversation today. Sabrina Thomas is born to Indian immigrants in the New York City area. Sabrina moved to the Dallas area at the age of 4, coming from a long line of Christians, tracing 5 generations back on each side of her family. Sabrina has a strong heritage of identifying with the Jewish roots of her Christian faith. Starting in 2004, Sabrina began teaching in Mesquite, Texas, her hometown. In 2006, she attended higher education studies at Regent University, and she earned a joint degree in the School of Law and in the Robertson School of Government. During that time, she participated in a study abroad program at Oxford University and had the privilege of visiting Israel as an Eagle's Wings Israel Experience scholar. Sabrina became a member of the Texas State Bar in 2011, and her political experience includes internships and staff positions for political campaigns and elected officials at the local, state, and federal level. As a result of her Christian heritage, educational background, and life experiences, Sabrina champions Jewish-Christian relations, and she serves as the American Israel Public Affairs Committee Southwest Christian Outreach Director. Okay, and in this role, she reaches out to pro-Israel Christians leaders in Texas and several states in the Southwest and in the Midwest, and promotes political advocacy regarding the U.S.-Israel relationship. So, welcome, Sabrina. I had the opportunity to be in Israel and get back just before all this quarantine started. So I have deep appreciation for the American-Israel connection. So thank you for being with us.
That's wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. One more panelist today is Latoya Hay. Latoya is a proud alumnus of Regent University, also class of 2019, with a master's in American government. And she's a proud community advocate, works to ensure that Christian leadership does change the world, which echoes the motto of Regent University. Currently, she's the regional director for the 3rd District of Virginia for the Trump Victory campaign. And she's the director of member relations for Blexit Virginia, a conservative nonprofit dedicated to changing the narrative of minority communities. And Latoya, you were also recently a candidate for public office. So you're probably glad that you didn't have to worry about public, social distancing when you were trying to run for clerk of the courts in Portsmouth, Virginia. Is that right?
Yes, of course. Campaigning is definitely much different this year than it was last year, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you each for joining us. And we're just going to jump right into some of the conversation now that is part of this panel. So the first thing I want to address is on our title of our panel is the word stewardship. Now, for Christians, stewardship is often thought of as dealing with money. So let me just ask this. Do Christians have the responsibility to be good stewards of things like liberty, democracy, justice, freedom? You name your ideals that we talk about in the United States. What is the role of Christians in that realm? Let me just open that up for the panel. Whoever would like to start us off.
Absolutely.
Everybody wants to go first. Okay, thank you, Jeff. Yes.
Sure. The question of do Christians have a responsibility to be good stewards of things, of liberty, democracy, justice? Not only do we have that responsibility, but we have this responsibility to teach this understanding. I'm in the middle of writing a voter's guide for Christians with a media personality. And one of the things that this is bringing to light and really reminding me of is that the men and women that designed our country, our system, that they not only designed it to work in a specific way, which our understanding of we're drifting, we're falling from, but they also assumed that we would work within that system, within a specific way. And that is fundamentally, they assumed and knew the system wouldn't work unless you were dealing with a populace that's informed, as well as disciplined, as well as reasoned, as well as deeply grounded in faith. You can look at Washington, Adams, you can even look at the deists like Jefferson. And over and over and over, we find this again, that without an understanding of, first of all, that a belief, sort of deeply grounded in the Platonic school of realism, that natural law exists. These are truths that are self-evident. We appeal to the laws of nature and God for these things. Without that founding, that fundamental underlying truth, the system has nothing to stand on. It's like a house without any foundation. You sort of look under there and you go, well, wait a minute. And what rushes into that gap, of course, in people's minds is the state, is statism, which is not how our system was designed. So I think as Christians, we have not only a duty to be aware of that ourselves, but to remind other Christians. A lot of people like to look to George Washington's closing address, a sort of farewell address, in which he said, of all of the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable results. Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. And that's good. But I would, I would point to another text, Catherine Bates' 1904 version of America the Beautiful, the oft neglected second verse, in which she wrote, "Oh, beautiful for pilgrims' feet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God, mend thy every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control. thy liberty in law. Our system doesn't work without an informed, disciplined, reasoned, and faith-filled populace. And as we fall away from not only those habits, and this isn't, I'm not excoriating the public at large with a wagging finger, but as we fall away from those habits, that becomes problematic. But also I see that we're falling away from even an understanding that our system was designed with that presumption in mind. And that to me is very problematic. And as Christian educators, I see that as one of our top priorities to remind that, to rekindle that in ourselves, and then to teach that to others.
All right, thank you. And clearly this time presents us some opportunity to revise a lot of what we do. Who else would like to jump in on that? Stewardship on these areas?
Go ahead, Katie.
I would say a quick word if I could. I think
Yeah,
so.
please.
At the Heritage Foundation, we're very engaged right now in seeing a restoration of the education of civics. And so this has been really not only on the decline, but also under attack from so many directions. And it's been really interesting to watch actually the role of Christians in being at the forefront of this fight. And it's happening in different ways. I think that Christians, for one thing, are maintaining some of the elements of education that are so critical to civics education, to knowing our history, and to understanding the elements that are so important to our nation. What I'm also seeing a big emphasis in Christian education, unlike other elements of our education, is a big emphasis on some of those skills that the Greeks and the Romans held so highly, like oratory and debate and rhetoric, being able to actually communicate your ideas. And I think that's, maybe we overlook this, but I think that's also an important part of stewardship, is being able to communicate the ideas that we value and being able to share those. And sometimes we despair because we feel like our numbers are smaller than the other side. But I think the skills that we're providing are so vital. And I think our youth are going to really, they're going to be our salvation in this. I think they're going to be the defenders of our nation, and it makes me really optimistic.
Good, thank you. Dr. Patterson, you were starting to talk, so.
I'd just say briefly that stewardship has to do with how we invest our time and our talents and our treasure. And that's not just individuals. We sometimes lose sight of that in terms of their vocations. We want them to meet their vocations. That's important for Christians, not to be sitting at home Netflixing all day, but how do they act in their vocations, their calling? But it's also true for our social institutions. God created the church. God created the family. And so these organizations are nonprofit civic associations that are designed to help people. All of these are designed to be in service mode at times like this. And that's really where I think right now the crux of stewardship is how are we living out as stewards rather than asking the government to do everything right now? How are we acting out in our vocation, whether I'm an individual or in the groups that I'm a part of?
Yes, good, thank you. Let me come back to stewardship maybe in a minute, but how is this pandemic affecting religious groups around the world? I mean, are there specific things that you're aware of, Dr. Patterson, because you guys deal with religious freedom as a Religious Freedom Institute. So maybe other religious groups are really suffering, maybe Christians in other places. What have you heard? What have you learned?
Well, certainly this pandemic has hit at a unique time. Easter, Passover, and Ramadan, the three largest religious expressions during the calendar year, not just in the US, but abroad, are all happening during this virus. And so it's been very different for people who are used to coming together to worship and to share, to not be able to. I'd say that there's two trends, and they're very different. On the one hand, globally, you see people of faith trying to figure out how do they meet the needs of their neighbor? How do they live by the golden rule? And I think all of us could tell you dozens and dozens of stories about that. We've been documenting them on our website at the Religious Freedom Institute. A second trend, though, is that there are places around the world where particularly Christians, for instance, in parts of West Africa, parts of Central Asia, where people of faith have been scapegoated as somehow they're part of the cause of this, either as a curse or because they're from a different community or they're a religious minority. And really what it's become is an excuse for some thuggish behavior by majorities to beat up on minorities. And of course, we need to just pull back that smoke screen and reveal it for what it is.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel have any comments about other religious minorities and how they're suffering? Okay, good, thank you. Is there a danger that we as Christians might become too focused on Christians, right, on ourselves, instead of maybe looking out to help others that are suffering?
I don't think so. I mean, at least that's not my experience, you know, I think I'm actually seeing a really good job among you know, I mean, I live in Missouri, and so I'm sort of right at the top of the Bible Belt. I'm a Catholic. I live in a parish, but we overlap with a number of different religious communities. Some of them as small as, you know, the church on the corner, and some of them as large as the Missouri Lutheran Synod. And I've actually been very pleased with the outreach and involvement across the community, whether it's Christian or not. I think the trend that I see that causes a little concern is this sort of movement towards remote worship, if you will. You know, they've canceled mass, they've canceled services, and religion by remote, or remote religion, however the phraseology should go, that has never worked well. You know, Diocletian understood this. Francis of Assisi knew this. Martin Luther knew this. Wesley, Miller, all of the men and women of the first and second Great Awakening knew this. That Jesus Christ knew this, and the Pharisees didn't. You know, he's what? He's having dinner with who? Oh my goodness! That you know, the connection, the outreach between our God and us is very human and personable. For that reason, I mean, it becomes redundant to explain that, and so I think that the challenge is, how do we understand and go back towards a person-to-person relationship within our faith, whether it's Christian to Christian or Christian to others, in this time in which we're being told, you know, you have to be this many feet apart. They're tearing pews out of the building of the church that we worship in. Where is that leading, that trend? I think I'd like to hear from other people, other members of the panel, if they've experienced something similar, and you know, what their thoughts are.
Yeah, well, actually, and let me ask Sabrina Thomas, because I know I actually talked to a professor in Israel a couple of weeks ago, a Jewish man, who's describing what they're doing on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, how instead of going to synagogue, they're going into the street and spacing down the street and spreading out to do their Sabbath prayers. So, I mean, that's another group that certainly is being affected by this. I don't know if you have any insights into, again, do Christians need to be concerned about some of these other religious groups? And of course, maybe you have some insight on that.
Well, so thank you for posing the question. I think that I may be taking a contraposition to Dr. Gardner, but I think it's always human nature to default to ourselves and to think about our immediate world. I think in a crisis situation, it's very important that we actually not only focus on ourselves, but look at a large and outside of ourselves. And so I think it's easy for us to think about what's happening here in our local community, what's happening in the United States, but to forego thinking what's happening internationally and how even solutions that we're finding here can be transplanted to other places or vice versa. And so I think in the immediate effect of this crisis, and people were talking about vaccines and technology, as a person who has focused on the US-Israel relationship, I knew that Israel's on the cutting edge of a lot of medical innovation. And so our hope in our work is that we could foster collaboration between the United States and Israel, foster policy that would encourage that in this response, we as the United States are not looking to only ourselves, but looking to reliable allies who are pro-US oriented, who share our values, going back to your first question about justice and freedom and democracy, all those values that we see here in the United States and as Christians we cherish. That's actually also the only country in the Middle East that can champion that and says that they're reliably that beacon of democracy. so that's where I would say that I'm slightly different in maybe my perspective. But I do think when we talk about social distancing and that application and how that's going to affect the church at large, I do think all religious communities, as Dr. Pattison pointed out, all of the major faiths are grappling with how do you not only maintain your personal religious faith, but how do you do that in the corporate body? I think that it's important that we see what are some of the tools and best practices that other communities are doing. And I think Israel's idea of being able to step out and have services that also are authentic to their faith, if they are more orthodox in their belief, and being able to stand out on the street, or a person who is secular and doesn't practice such a strong orthodox religion. I think we as Christians can see those parallels amongst our various denominations as well here in America.
Thank you. Let me just,
what I see happening with the virtual churches, it kind of reminds me of the verse, Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 1, where it states, "Woe be unto the pastors that destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture." And it's some of these churches that I see turning into virtual, I feel like they're losing a lot of their flock. And I'm not really sure how they are going to be able to bring some of those people back. A lot of people were, entering the church and coming to the church due to some of the issues that they were having personally, and they needed that. They needed that fellowship. They needed that guidance, that discipline to be in church for Bible study, for service. And now that we're relying on being at home and just doing it virtually, some people I hear, they're on their phones while they're out shopping, listening to the preacher. They're really not dedicated and listening to what the word is being said to them. So I find it that unless some of these pastors and bishops are actually taking that personal approach to ensuring that their members of their church are getting that fellowship, that touch and agreeing that we all need, and especially in times like this, I feel like we could be losing a lot of the Christian members that were relying on that fellowship to help them get through. And they may start relying on other things to start helping them get through, being that the churches are shut down.
If I could, I'd like to follow up on, and that's precisely the point.
Tall order, I think, for pastors to.
It is extremely tall order. And, and here is the LaToya, you put your finger on something that's so critical, because here's the challenge. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Marshall McLuhanite, and he among many things, he famously quipped that the medium is the message, and I think that can be taken as much as a warning as an understanding of our relationship to technology. There is a specific relationship between our hand and our head. We are tool makers by design. This, to me, in my assessment, this is part of the stamp of the image of God on each and every one of us. We cannot help ourselves but constantly go from conceptual to actual. We may not be able to say fiat lux, let there be light, but every one of us every day says fiat cenam, let there be dinner. And we go from what we're thinking about to something on the plate. We can't help ourselves. And when you take this tool, and this becomes the means by which we have a religious encounter, well, there is a danger here, because imagine if you had a missal or you had a common book of prayer, and when you opened it up, or a meditation, out from it also would pop, let's say common book of prayer, out from it would pop a flyer advertising the latest play by Shakespeare, or something more salacious that had nothing to do with your faith encounter or spiritual nourishment or whatever that you're doing via this technology. And churches have not fared well, and I mean across the board, I believe, in competing with secular entertainment. And those who have tried, and we've seen this particularly in the Catholic Church, have fared very, very badly. And in fact, I think that those of us who worked in that field have discouraged them. You don't have the budget that YouTube has and Google has. Don't try to compete in that way. And so there's this, we're moving into this territory in which, if this is our means of connection, what else is coming out of this? And as McLuhan was getting at, are we moving towards a scenario in which we're worshiping the device as much as, or we're impacted by the device as much as the content therein? And so I think, Latoya, you put your finger on something extremely important as Christians and Christian educators.
Thank you.
Stephen, can I just make one very quick point? It's
Sure.
that many faiths have religious obligations that have to happen in community. So the Eucharist for Catholics, confession, etc. You think about Muslims, the requirement to go on the Hajj at some point in their life. So there's a whole set of obligations that are deeply intrinsic to our faith. We can kind of get by for a little while sitting in a church parking lot and listening to the sermon on AM radio, as long as the police don't come and kick us out.
Yeah.
It seems like a gross government overreach. But over time, there's many, many important things that as we practice faith that have to happen in community.
Well, I want to turn to Judge Joseph Wood because he hasn't had a chance to weigh in here yet. And your point about, police overreach and so forth, that actually is kind of my next question, is we balance a lot of things in this fight against the pandemic. We've balanced health concerns against economic concerns, and we're balancing health concerns against faith concerns as well. And so communities struggle with that. I don't know if you have any of that going on in Washington County, Arkansas, but I bet that you do.
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, I think this, when you go to mandated shutdown in your states, is that going a bridge too far? In Arkansas, at least, we were able to manage not to shut down and say shelter in place, but just do it slowly. And so that really did cause people to take some ownership and balance what they were doing and how they were doing it. I think good balance looks differently for different people, in particular believers. The new believer is still on the milk, and the Dr. Gardners of the world and Doc Perry's of the world, they may be a little bit deeper, and Sister Thomas here. So I think the balance is always going to be different. To put the onus of responsibility on the leader of the church, I think is a responsibility that they take on, leading God's people, as far as what will I do? I know in Ohio was a big one. I'm going to have church. I'm going to bring people in here, no matter what the numbers were looking like, et cetera. You had to say, okay, let's look at this. And are you leading his people, or are they your people? How are you being smart about that? And so as a judge, I am responsible for obviously the county and the people in the county. And I'm looking at my walk and my faith as well, and balancing the two. What is it that we're called to do? It's two things in my mind, simply. You go back to stewardship, or you talk about, is there a danger that we just talked about? I think if we're called to the great commandment, which is to love one another as we love God, and then the second is the Great Commission, keep our light on, as a congressman talked about, and share the good news. How do I do that? And I only do that as being a good steward, and that's everybody in everything that we do. Psalms, I think it is, what is it? Psalms talks about the world is his and the people therein. And so anything and everything, if we're believers, we are now to be good stewards of anything and everything that he's entrusted to us, whether it be liberty and freedoms, whether that be the people or the businesses that we're in my case, it's the county. And so when I was the Deputy Secretary of State, one of the very first things that we did was talk about values. And our number one value was stewardship. You don't hear that in business. You don't hear that in public service and all. But for me and for some of the other leaders, the Secretary of State at the time, Mark Martin, it was important for us because we are believers. And how do we make sure that what we've been entrusted to, the taxpayer dollars, the employees there, entire state, how do we make sure that we're doing what we can to make sure that when we give it back, it's in better shape, it's in better condition, that the dollars were best spent, et cetera. Well, now as a county judge, guess what? One of our values that we have is not only being good leaders, providing good services, but it's number one of our values is stewardship. And so I think it all comes together. Lastly, Dr. Gardner, I think I do hear what you're saying, but I think Sabrina talked about it. I think we do operate what's in it for me. We are kind of a selfish individuals until we come to know Christ, and then we understand it's not just about us all the time, 24/7. It is about serving his people and using the tools that he's equipped us with, being guided by the Holy Spirit to do that. And so how do we make sure that we're delivering and living that in our daily walk, which is tough. And I'll lastly say this: we got the National Day of Prayer coming up in a couple of days, and really watching and working with ministers across the county, whether it be Catholic and Baptist, we're bringing them all together in a day of prayer. And so I think this whole time of pandemic, we get beyond maybe some of our religious shades and say, yeah, this is all different right now. And we all got to be about leading God's people, his people, and making sure our light is on. So when we get through this, because this is how this country got started, through the leadership of the believer. And so I think there's the hope.
Thank you so much. I appreciate those great comments and what you guys are doing down there in Arkansas. Let's move on to a new area. And while we do that, I mean, just remind those of you who are watching online and you know, if you're in the audience today, you know, there's a lot of you out there. So if you have heard people make comments that you have a question on, you'd like to follow up, if you go to the bottom of your screen, please post those in the Q&A box. And later on, we're going to turn to everybody to ask them to, you know, we'll pose some of those questions to everybody and ask them to answer your questions. I would note also in the chat area, Dr. Patterson has posted a link to the Religious Freedom Institute and COVID-19 challenge that they've got that as a link there. So just resources that you can use and access. At this point, let's just talk about policy a bit. So one of the kind of mind-blowing policy changes, and Judge Wood, you kind of just alluded to this, is that there's kind of almost a ceasefire between religion and government, right? And this sometimes what is seen as this adversarial relationship. And the CARES Act allowed money to be spent just on equal measure with faith-based nonprofits, which includes churches. If they have employees, if they've lost income due to this, they can use a grant from the government to pay employees, even if they are religiously employed people. So this is something very new. And so from a Christian perspective, I guess, policy perspective, is this good or does it raise any red flags? Let me just ask what you, maybe let's just turn to Katie Gorka again. Let me ask Katie, is that something you all have thought about?
Well, I feel bad. I know LaToya wants to say something and she might have a better answer to this. I mean, for me, this does not raise the red flag. I think there are other things that have happened that are more critical red flags. And I wanted to just read, there's one comment that Andy McCarthy just made about what's going on. And he said, it's not the burden of Americans to prove that the exercise of their fundamental rights is essential. The burden is on the state to demonstrate that the right in question cannot be exercised safely under any conditions less severe than those the state is imposing. So for me, the biggest concern has been what the governors has done. And the fact that they can decide, that governors have been able to decide that abortions are essential, but church services are not. Or that hardware is essential, but church services are not. And that's where I think a lot of our focus should be. Okay. I'm not as worried about this provision, but LaToya might disagree. She might have something else to say.
LaToya, go ahead.
In my opinion, I definitely think this is a slippery slope. I definitely think this creates major red flags within the churches and the government. I don't believe that the government should be tossing money to the churches during this pandemic. I feel that it could be a way for them to create some sort of control later on, being that they did throw some hush money out currently to them. Not only that, some of these churches, especially with the CARES Act on how they are allowing these churches to get this money, they don't even have to prove who these workers are. You know, so you could have some of these churches that are paying all of their family members or that are just are ensuring that they stay closed down to collect the money, especially with some of these smaller churches who maybe their members weren't tithing as much as the CARE Act is going to give them to stay closed. So in my opinion, especially with with the most majority of the churches, I feel aren't saying anything about the current mandate of shutting them down. I feel like them being so quiet regarding, let's keep Home Depot open and the ABC store and let's close down the churches. I feel like we should be more up in an uproar regarding why they are not stating or saying anything. And with the government now offering them money, I don't feel that they're going to be much more vocal on ensuring that their rights are protected and they are opening. So I do feel that this is a slippery slope, and nothing's free. And with them now giving churches money to pay for staff and unemployment, I don't see how that is going to help the churches. And I don't really see that it's necessary. What God's will be done, and what Christians, I feel, especially within the church, should be relying on is the Lord at this moment, and not just relying on getting money and incurring additional debt, just to help them through a pandemic that we don't even know how long it's going to last. It's too quick, in my opinion, to be handing money out. So I do think it creates some really red flags.
Yeah, look.
Steve,
So, Latoya certainly brings up questions about this. Sure, go ahead.
So my biggest concerns are things about the national debt exploding, getting the country back to work and things. A lot of the things I've seen from Katie's organization. I would say this about the CARES Act and the Payroll Protection Program. What I'd be most worried about, and this didn't happen, is if the government said, we'll give this money only to secular organizations as we define it. That would be actually very, very troubling. In other words, we've had actually quite a bit of history in the past half century where the government has said, we'll fund this secular thing, but if it smacks at all of religion, there's not a level playing field. We will discriminate against religious groups, we'll discriminate against religious people, groups like the Salvation Army, ones that are trying to help people, but being discriminated against from federal funds being available to them to feed the poor. So what we do want to see, I think, is a level playing field. That would be a principle through all of this. And I think it's a good news story that we haven't seen faith-based actors excluded from these types of programs.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. Let me kind of jump on the different groups that are differently impacted by COVID-19. So poverty seems to be an issue. Rural versus urban in terms of maybe access, or in terms of overcrowding and how it affected people. Are there any places the church might have a role in advocating for government policy to help in these arenas, some different areas? Anybody want to take that on?
I think the question here is not whether there are church groups that advocate, and this has been my business for the last decade and a half, is working with NGOs and 501c3s that work nationally and internationally. There's a lot of that going on. That is that advocacy. I think the challenge, especially when you're dealing with something like health, is what is it that we're emphasizing? We have moved towards a system, a conceptualization in which we think equality means equality of outcome, and that not only is incorrect, but that can never work. And so it's okay to tailor different solutions in different situations. And so if you have a poor urban population, and one of the issues with this pandemic specifically is the means by which the virus is spread, that is, we are the vectors, and how it goes from one individual to another. And I wouldn't, not to sort of rain fury down from the pulpit like John Wesley used to do, but it really is as simple as cleanliness is next to godliness. Now, that doesn't have to be a message that is carried through proselytization, but to say, look, you know, these are the habits that you have to adapt, or you have to adopt, excuse me, to keep from becoming infected with this disease. And that in no way is moralizing, that in no way is marginalizing the poor or stereotyping them. It simply is a very common sense, level-headed recognition that you know, within certain groups, when you have behaviors that disadvantage the outcome for the group, ultimately the solution is to get at the cause and not the symptom. And we seem to, you know, across the populace, we hamstring ourselves in these efforts, because when you begin that, when you speak to, say, poverty, you say, well, you know, I remember Newt Gingrich had written a piece, and he was just excoriated for suggesting that one of the causes of poverty is a lack of exampled work. That is, when you have successive generations that don't see the generation ahead of them going to work, this tends to breed the problem. This isn't moralizing or stereotyping or you know, being racist towards any particular group. This is attacking the problem. So I think we have to get over that hurdle and find ways to communicate this, and, you know, get over the fear of being labeled as fear mongering as policymakers and advocates as we do it.
Thank you. Any other comments? How about maybe Judge Wood? Either these policies, or are there others that surround the pandemic that maybe Christians would support? You as a county manager there in Arkansas, is there places the church could be helping in terms of advocating or teaching its members, or where would you put the role of the church in this?
Sure. I go back to the inception of the country, where most of our schools and our healthcare and our hospitals, our orphans, that was all being managed and taken care of. The social welfare, if you will, of the people was taken care of by the church and believers. And as the years have rolled by, we've seen this abdication of that role to, and ceded that to the state and federal governments. And so now you find yourself in this crosshairs. We look to the state, we look to the federal government. Latoya just highlighted, why are they picking up and doing all this stuff for the church? Well, partly because that's some of the things that we should have never let go and got our hand off, because no matter how good the intent of a federal program, it won't have the heart of our local church, of our local nonprofit. And so there's kind of a joint relation that we have between the federal government and the church. Like it or not, it has been, and I think this becomes always the time for the church to stand back up, as we did on 9/12. 9/11 happened, 9/12, you saw the church getting together. You saw Americans were Americans, and they were out and really pulling, and you're starting to see some of this very, very same thing. I'll end with this last piece. Is we have a number of believers in our federal government. And I would imagine the Congresswoman, she's one. And so they saw this, and they saw fit to put the church as part of some of these CARES Act or the PPE, et cetera. And so with that thought of including everyone, including the church, who's going to be closest to where the rural or the hungry or the poor are, they can touch that and influence it and impact it in a whole different way. I think that's also the leader that we would be looking to say, okay, now that we've gotten to this place, how do we make sure that we start focused on deficit and debt elimination? How do we make sure that we are being, again, good stewards of what we've been entrusted to? Again, we took on the responsibility of saying we have people hurting, we have neighborhoods, communities, and we've made this overture, $4 trillion, if you will, but we are also going to be real good about making sure that we do all we can to pull and rein that back in. So it's a combination of balance there.
Okay, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, and then we're going to go to question and answer. So again, one more opportunity. If you've got some questions, feel free to post those in the Q&A spot at the bottom of your screen if you're one of our audience members. Let me turn to Ms. Thomas here and just ask, what are some things that you think that Christians can do to practice love in other ways, or maybe who should they care for first? Should they be caring for Christians? Should they be caring for others? Do you have any insights on any of that?
Well, so I would just say from a personal and very much a practical, I don't think that it's an either or, that we go to others or to, like, fellow believers or other people. We should be doing it both. It should be an approach that is, you see the humanity of the person and then see them through the eyes of Christ, that they're a human being created in his image, and therefore you should be expressing his hope, his strength that we have, and that's showing compassion and caring. That's understanding in this reality right now, people's, not only their professional, but also their personal lives have been turned upside down, expressing empathy in whatever way it needs to be, extending his grace and his characteristics in whatever, in the most practical, personal settings, be it a colleague who all of a sudden now finds them working at home and children all around and they can't answer the email that you desperately need them to answer as a colleague and a professional so you can do your job, but realizing that that's their new reality and no one could have anticipated this a few months ago. And I think that's on a very personal, intimate level, expression of love and caring that Christ would expect of us. And that would go to a Christian colleague or any person of faith or no faith at all. And then as a personal, it's realizing you can't segregate the person's professional from their personal, and remembering that your relationships with your personal network, be it your family or friends, are now going to have to take a whole new way of approach, and that you have to release yourself to understand that that's new, and that you may not do this the way that you would have thought you would of maintaining those relationships and being kind and caring, that may be taking care of elderly parents. Or I have a really close friend who gave birth in the midst of this dynamic of, after years of in vitro, finally having twins, and I haven't been able to see my friend for more than a month, and that's really hard. But can I segregate that personal from the working professional I am, of the work that I'm doing? No, not if I'm being authentic. No, I have to realize that that's an emotional wear, but does not mean I'm not going to keep doing my work, which is making sure that I don't forget that even in the midst of this new reality, my work is still vital. And I think, if anything, as we're doing our professional new reality assessment and dealing with the current crisis in front of us, we don't forget the things that we were doing before this hit. And how do we adapt it so that way this is turning lemons into lemonade? Like, maybe instead of seeing these new realities as a problem, saying, well, is this a way that I can adapt to actually maybe innovate things that in the past I would never have thought to do? So yes, being social distance is causing the church to have to reevaluate its approach, but it's also expanding our audience in ways that we may not have ever been able to engage before this virus happened. And it's the same thing for those of us in the political field. Yes, it's difficult to get mobilizing people to our activity. In my case, engaging people onto the work that I want them to help us with. But I can actually say instead, well, are there areas that I couldn't have done before that today, because of this virus, we're being forced to have to think about it now? I think that's a very hard reality that we have to do, but that's not until you're emotionally authentic with yourself. And then realizing that you have to be kind and gracious to the other, then only can you approach seeing this not for a cumbersome endeavor, but instead a very open and freeing experience.
Excellent. Go ahead. I think someone else was going to chip in there. Is that Dr. Gardner, I think?
No, I thought that was very well said.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry. Excellent. I think I muted my mic for a second. Yes. So there's a lot of different roles for people of faith, for Christians, that extend beyond maybe what we would think in terms of giving. And that's certainly an area that may be most obvious, but those emotional needs that people have, and just being the individuals that can continue to be caring. So as our audience, hopefully, many are tuning in because they're thinking about what is the role of the Christian in this. I think that really is a good place for us to stop and pause and turn to some questions. Let me just as we're getting ready to go to questions, and we'll invite Kylan Griffith to come on and introduce some questions to us. But let me just make the disclaimer that all of our panelists today, even though they come from the different organizations, represent them, their views are their own, and they're not necessarily representing the views of their organization. So I should have said that at the beginning. I had it in my notes, and I totally stepped across that, but we do thank everyone for sharing their views with us. So the same will be true as we continue on with trying to answer some of the questions that have come up. So if Kylan has a question for us, go ahead and read the first question to our panel, and then we'll let them take it away.
Absolutely. So I think I'm going to start with one that I believe came from Dr. Stephen King, another Regent professor. He was wondering, how do we as Christians, whether individually or part of organizations, become part of the solution rather than the problem in promoting unity across divides, whether political, social, or spiritual?
Okay. So that question is, thrown out at you. I mean, we have some obvious divides in America. I don't know if anybody wants to take that on, but there's also, wasn't it in somebody's bio that I just read? Something about unity was part of the the stuff that they had worked on.
I will jump out there, and one, I do think that if you're trying to figure out what is your role and how do you play, I think it's spending time quietly and praying and meditating, thinking about, Lord, what is it that you have me to do? And I can see from where I sit, I've seen it from the young kid who's now at home doing his education and studies as a scout, a Boy Scout, who sent me a note and saying, hey, I have a project, I really want to get a badge and working on it, and it's on civic engagement and all. What is some problem that you see? And I turned it back to him, and we started talking, and he started talking about, well, I do see a number of veterans who are homeless. I said, well, we have a huge veteran service organization. We're doing a lot, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had a good conversation. But after that, my recommendation was going back to his troop and saying, why don't you guys work on looking at adopting a group of veterans, whether they be at the home, finding veterans that you guys can work with as a troop, as a project, you get your badge and all, but you also get some learning from these veterans. The veterans get the support and all. So that's a small on the young people's end, trying to figure out what I can do to contribute to help in this. Now you can go all the way to the other end, like I mentioned earlier. You could be a congresswoman and writing legislation. There's going to be a CARES Act that goes out to. But on the same front, you're going to be also writing legislation that when this is all through, here's the legislation that we're going to be doing to draw back and pull this in or cut the massive expenses that we're spending in certain areas to pay back. So I think you can go from slowing down and saying, what can I do? And asking the Lord to help lead you in that particular piece, Dr. King.
Okay, great. Let me just ask Katie Gorka, because you're the one who said you serve as the director of the Fulner Institute's Center for Civil Society. And that question was really about civility in society. So just let you answer on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really tough one because we are so divided. But I will say this as Christians, I think this was maybe Sabrina's comment that by nature, we do think of ourselves first. And that's absolutely okay to acknowledge that. But I think then what we have to remember is Christians, we are asked to practice the virtue of charity. And it's treated as a virtue, as something separate from ourselves or something that maybe doesn't come naturally because it is a little bit hard. And I think it's an extraordinary, this is actually a moment of extraordinary grace because charity is not always easy. Being civil across the divide is certainly not easy. But I would say in my lifetime, never has it been easier, never has there been greater opportunity and greater need for me to be charitable. It's like God has given me this opportunity to be charitable, to reach across the divide. And I think the burden on me is to cultivate that virtue. Think of it the way Aristotle said, virtue is a little bit like a skill. You have to think of it that way. It's not something that comes naturally. It's something you cultivate. It's something you actively work on. So I would say for all of us as Christians, I think there's just a beautiful moment here for us to cultivate this virtue and in whatever way we can, whether it's the conversation with the neighbor, or giving money to the local restaurant or a local business that's struggling. Honestly, I don't think most of us, when we do that anyway, we don't say, are they Christian or not? We see where the need is and we go there. It's a great moment. It's a great opportunity for us right now.
I think Dr. Gardner, you're nipping at the bit on this one. Is that right?
Yeah, I couldn't second that more. As a Christian, I mean, we all have our individual experiences. I was raised a Mormon, spent most of my life as an atheist, and then became a Christian much later in my life. And one of the things that I found as I sort of stumbled and clawed, with fear and trembling my way to Christ, was that, as Christians, you often hear people asking, what's God's plan for my life? Which is absolutely an important question. In my own, coming to the faith, I found what was more instructive was to ask, what's God's plan for somebody else's life that involves me? And as a meditation, I found that tremendously, helpful. Doesn't even come close to scratching the surface. So I wanted to, echo what Catherine was saying, that this is a time, an opportunity for great grace and great graces for all of us as Christians.
Excellent, thank you. Kylie, the next question for us.
Yeah, so I thought a good next question would be that it was submitted, much of our discussion around civil liberties in the midst of COVID-19 is focused on what we have the right to do, not what we ought to do. And how can Christians, faith leaders, and government officials demonstrate the virtue of self-restraint in the middle of this crisis without compromising our civil liberties?
All right. Everyone get that question? It's a little long. Anyone want to take that one on?
I mean, when speaking of
You need
policy set forth, I mean, I think that they've already overstepped some of their boundaries as far as what we are told we can and cannot do. I feel like as Americans, I'm kind of disappointed in the fact that we just let some things go and slide without questioning it. It's like we didn't question anything. We just kind of did what they said do, and we just lay down. And I feel like as Christians, we do have, a civil right to stand up to some of the policies and even the safety concerns that they're putting in place. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And instead of us actually questioning what they're saying and what they're actually doing, even within the stores, I mean, we're just all just following and not actually being a leader within our towns and our communities and saying anything. We're not questioning anything. We're just doing what the government says, and we're not actually looking what makes sense, because a lot of the safety concerns, in my opinion, they don't even make any sense for me to follow, and I'm just kind of blindly doing it because we're told to do it. But at the same time, as a Christian, I feel like there is at some points where we need to stand up and see what exactly they're telling us to do, and if it's right, and if it's something that we should be fighting for as far as our civil liberties, which I think is our duty as Christians, to stand up for our liberties.
Clearly the orders we shouldn't wear masks, now everybody should wear masks. Clearly we are feeling our way through this. The government is feeling its way through this. And I think we as people, psychologically, we're feeling our way through this. To what extent do we just go along, and when should there be some pushback? And I think certainly we're seeing that across the country. Kylan, is there more to that question? That did we get that answered, or is there more there? I don't know if you want to read it again, or or go on to the next question. Either one.
I think we can probably move on.
Okay.
So this is a question that is aimed at everybody individually. Historically, in times of plague, Christians have run towards the sick and hurting. In the age of social distancing, what does running towards the needy and helping them look like for each of you in your respective contexts?
Okay. That's a good question.
Interesting question.
Stephen, I'll take one quick whack at this, and that is, first, we need to not let CNN or the New York Times tell us how bad Christians have been, they've focused on a very small subset of cases where churches stayed open. And frankly, in some of those cases, it looked like it was the pastor trying to be braggadocious rather than really thinking about what the needs were of his community. But within a couple of weeks of this, 90% of American churches and other houses of worship had closed to large groups to try to protect people out of the golden rule. And so in this time, what it really looks like is asking the question, how do I love my neighbor? And that doesn't mean that there's no contact. The church is going to be at its strongest, not in buildings, but it's going to be Christians and other people of faith going next door to their next door neighbor, seeing what their needs are, taking care of those needs. The body of Christ is not in a building, it's extended all around the earth. And that's really going to be the hallmark. They will know us by our love.
All right,
very good. I would echo that exactly. A couple of things I've seen: a Salvation Army, tremendous organization, and the outreach that they do, but not turning off, because again, our heart is to serve those who are in need. And so you saw them holding and having lines, distance, but yet they were still providing bags of clothes and food. We had a vendor who does barbecue, and he said, I got to do something. And so he started prepping a whole lot more food and giving it away, but he brings it out in big tubs. And again, people will come. You got to be socially responsible when you're doing this. Obviously, make sure you have your gears and that whole piece, but you can find your way through it. It just calls imagination, it calls creativity. And I think everybody's really finding their way through what is taking and loving, as Doc Patterson talked about. How can we love in a different way than we had been doing it before, and keep doing it? Because again, people will see how the church stands as we walk through this, because they're looking for the church to do it. This is how we started this beacon of hope called America, by leading and being out in front. And I think this is our opportunity to start doing that again.
I'd like to add something too, if I could, because I thought Judge Wood made a really lovely point earlier, which is that a lot of the stewardship has been conceded to the state, but we don't need to concede that to the state. Right. And so, for example, when it comes to small businesses, the money and various programs that are being provided by the government are, honestly, they're small band-aids for most small businesses. And I don't think it's inappropriate at this time, if we have businesses in our communities that we care about and that serve us well, simply making cash donations. We have one program like that in Virginia. But my husband and I, we actually decided we're just going to go give some cash to people. And I know that that's kind of out of our sort of normal practice, right? But these are extraordinary times, and I think it's a danger to assume that what the state is doing or what the government's doing is going to meet the needs of all people, because it's not.
Yeah, and just, actually being a customer of some of these businesses that are struggling, putting a tip on the bill, even though there's the person that's serving you the food is serving it over a counter and you're having to take it home to eat it. You might give a tip on the bill. There's different ways you can do this that are really uplifting to somebody. So those are great points. Let's go ahead to our next question. Kylan, you got another one for us?
Yeah, this one was actually aimed at Dr. Patterson. He posted a link to the RFI COVID challenge in the chat. And so how important is it for Christian leaders to share the inspiration of their faith as a source of hope and strength during this crisis?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The biggest thing that Christians should be doing is pointing to the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. And that should be a reflection of what we do and what our demeanor is. The Bible tells us very clearly that ours is not a spirit of fear, but it's a spirit of power. Another way to say that is confidence and of authority and of a sound mind. And so we Christians, this is a tremendous opportunity to be the ones who are reaching out to the people around us who are in fear, who are concerned, who are anxious. There's a lot of people who still have their jobs and are anxious at this time. There's others who don't. But we know that our confidence rests on Christ. And this isn't a moment just for the luminaries of Christendom to be taking the lead. It's really, we've all got to be kind of citizen Christian block captains and reaching out to our neighbors, reaching out to the people who are in our sphere of influence, reaching out to high school associates 20 years later who we've been contacting on Facebook, doing Zoom meetings with friends of ours to stay connected. That we've got to be using our time diligently to be sharing the love of Christ and demonstrating hope.
Thank you. All right, next question.
Yeah, so another one is that saying that we as Christians are to have stewardship, both individually and collectively, is one thing, but acting upon and implementing that stewardship through a viable political framework is yet another. How do Christians fulfill political stewardship as a unified whole?
Okay, who would like to take that one on?
I mean, I feel like Christians, I mean, it goes back to being stewards of, liberty and justice. I feel, getting involved in the political world, even if it's just as simple as attending your school board meetings or your civic league meetings, just continually having a voice within the community, and to ensure that your Christian values are being instituted within some of these leadership positions by voting in the correct people, by looking at the politicians as a whole, just kind of doing your civic duty to ensure that you are being a part of your community and reaching out in those different aspects.
I'll take a whack at that. Especially across many denominational lines, to ask Christians to work together is sometimes a challenge for Christians. It shouldn't be, but it often is. But I think in particular in this time, we first and foremost as Christians, we need, if we don't already vigorously, we need to get back into Scripture and read very carefully what it was, or rather how it was that Christ tackled these problems. Whenever you're dealing with a scenario in which there's fear among the populace, whether it's founded or not. And I would argue that a lot of this fear is not founded. It's not founded in the science, it's not founded in the numbers, but that's irrelevant. That we must pay very careful attention to our modality of communication. And one of the things that we see in Scripture from Christ is this practice of indirect communication. It often profits nothing. In fact, it becomes counterproductive to whether we're talking about the maintenance of basic civil liberties. You can't just throw out the Bill of Rights because you think somebody's going to get sick. All these sorts of things, to programs in our schools, that when you're dealing with a time and a period and a people in panic, they're much more likely and faster to flip the off switch when you speak with them. If you're not very deliberate about using modes of direct communication, and you don't have to study this as a communication theory and a practice. You can get it right from Scripture. And so I think as Christians, we need to spend time not only with the salvific message of Scripture, but if you like, with the technical message. How is it that during a time of crisis and panic, and that was certainly the case when Christ walked the earth, and they had a lot of reason for panic and for fear. How was it then that you can communicate, and as they themselves recognized, what it was some really hard sayings, a really tough message to a populace in a way that resonates, so that when the messenger is gone, that the message picks up and continues. And I think as Christians, we have this tool by way of the Scripture, and we should look at it from that perspective. And if we haven't been doing this already, this is an opportunity to get back in and do more of that.
All right, thank you. We may have time for one more question here. Kylan, do you have one more for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's basic, but I think it's important. How has this crisis presented the opportunity for the panelists, you guys, as Christian leaders, to share your faith?
I think I've actually prayed more for my non-believer friends than I ever have due to their own request. I've always prayed for them, but I feel like there's more people that were necessarily, non-believers that are getting, that are frantic and panicking, and, their only thing that they could ask is, can you pray for me? So I feel like in my personal life, I've prayed more by request for non-believers.
Okay, good. Judge Wood, did you have a comment there?
Yes, I was going to say a lot of times you feel like you're isolated and alone. And it's only when you go into prayer or I go into prayer that I can go back into this place that, no, I'm with you. And that's who you're talking with, and we'll lead you through that. But I also think that you have to acknowledge, as Dr. Gardner just got to saying, you have to acknowledge the fact that people have these real concerns and these real fears. And it's quick and easy to dismiss them as nothing, and it's not. You have to acknowledge where they are, but lead them through. And you may have some of the same anxiousness or some of the same concerns, but you hold on to your faith, which is what's driving you and leading you through. They're looking for that, and so I have to constantly work within Scripture, leading like Jesus is a Bible app that I just went through, and it's every day, and you're walking through how Jesus led in times, as we just talked about, his 33 here on the earth, but then also fellowship with others who are in the same type of boat and same position, fellowshipping with other believers. So again, you're reminded that, one, you're not alone, and he uses people. When we talk about the government, when we talk about the state, those are us. They are people who we know, who come from our communities, who come from our church, that we elected, that we send on. So that's why we are called to pray for them to do the exact same thing. Remember that you're called to the Lord has called and said, these are his people. You're to keep your light on. And so when we start looking at how do we get through this, how do we navigate through it, one, you got to make sure you stay in the foundation and you're rooted in Christ, letting the Holy Spirit lead you and guide you. But two, you fellowship with others as iron sharpens iron. And so having a cast of folks here, I now have broadened my audience. So when I'm in that place, now I know hopefully I can pick up the phone and call somebody to say, hey, help me navigate through this, because we're expected, people are going to be looking for us to help navigate and get us through this. And we will. I believe Christians will be the ones that will continue to move and get us through here. And again, those who are in government, Congress, and or in our state houses, how are we calling on them or praying for them, and then fellowshipping with them to make sure that they are walking as Christ would have us to walk?
All right. Is there anyone else that wanted to answer that question? All right. Well,
they're asking us personally how we each as individuals are managing this. Our household has been affected by this. The kids are all out of school. Financially, it has affected our house. We've seen a significant reduction in household income. So I think personally, my wife and I, we are meditating daily and deeply on that call all throughout Scripture to do not be afraid, and continue our lives of stewardship. We haven't had a mass since I can't remember when now, but we continued our financial tithe to our parish to continue to support and even additionally support food banks. I don't know if this counts as great Christian spiritual growth, but we've made a commitment, even with the reduction of finances for the household, to frequent at least once a week restaurants in the takeout in our area. If that's faith, I could be faithful every night. But instead of saying, okay, whoa, wait a minute, we're the income is down by how much? Well, we can't afford that. Well, neither can the families that run these businesses and depend on it. So, but that all comes back to, meditating and repeating and praying together as a family. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. But at the same time, and I think LaToya, I like your spirit, a lot of spunk there, That doesn't simply mean that we roll over and say, oh yes, of course, now we have to stay home indefinitely just because if you lived in Michigan, the governor is knocking heads with the legislature, with the people. No, it doesn't mean that, but to not lose it, to hang on as we get through this, and we'll get through this. So don't be afraid. That's where we're at personally.
Well, thank you for these great panelists, for all your answers to these questions and such wonderful input. That is kind of all the time we're going to have for this session. Tomorrow, though, we've got some more opportunities. So if you are listening as part of our audience, 10 a.m. Eastern time, so GMT -4, we actually have people that have contacted me from Morocco and Nigeria who've signed up for this webinar series. It's not 1 p.m. where you are, but you figure out the time, Greenwich Mean Time -4, it's 1 p.m. So I'm sorry, that was today. 10 a.m. tomorrow, so that would be 2 p.m. at Greenwich Mean Time. We have our lockdown advocacy, maintaining and engaging your socially isolated advocacy networks. All right, so that's at 10 a.m. And then we do at 1 p.m. have a second panel tomorrow. There'll be a gap in between, a break, and then we'll come back for finding and reaching your majority from at least 6 feet away. So these are very kind of campaign oriented messages that we're going to have. How do you campaign in this time frame? And actually, Latoya Haight will be back on our panel, one of our panels tomorrow, and she clearly will have experience from working with the Trump campaign. And then we have a representative from the Bernie Sanders campaign out in California, directed that campaign, and she's going to be a part of our panel. So we have people that represent different political perspectives, but the important thing is just to deal with how do we continue to foster democracy and the ongoing need to be a government of, by, and for the people during a time of pandemic. So that's tomorrow. Please come back, join us again, and we will be making a recording of each of our panels available to those of you who have registered as well. Thank you so much, and thank you again to all of our panelists. If the audience could, I know they would applaud right now, but don't have that option on the Zoom. But thank you again, and I look forward to keeping in touch with all of you. God bless.